For my fellow Americans, Happy Independence Day. For everyone else, Happy Tuesday. Regardless of your nationality, it's a happy day indeed, because it's time for my monthly roundup and review of all the books, mostly horror, I've read over the last month, meaning in this case, June of 2023. Well, as I said, it's Independence Day, the 4th of July, one of my favorite holidays, of course. But that also means that it is indeed July, which would seem to indicate that June is over. And as such, it's time to list off all the books I read last month. My apologies for not getting this posted immediately upon the end of June, but I was off tending to both business and pleasure at Fan Expo Denver, a rather massive convention, so this was simply the soonest I could possibly get this video filmed, edited, and posted. But enough about me, let's start talking about some books. Let me remind you, as always, if you're interested in any of the books I'm about to talk about, and if you want to get copies for yourselves, you can indeed find purchase links down in the What's It. With all the prefatory material out of the way, we begin this month with The Auctioneer by Joan Samson. This book was originally published in the mid-1970s and achieved a sort of cult status. This particular edition, featuring a foreword by Grady Hendrix, came out a few years ago as part of the Paperbacks from Hell line, and I say God bless them for resurrecting some of these books from decades past, even if the prices are a little bit on the outrageous side for these mass market paperbacks. They're priced more like trade paperbacks. That's all I need to say about pricing. But it's important that we shouldn't just read new horror, though new horror is great, but we should also remember the books of yesteryear. So I was pretty excited to dig into a book I'd been hearing about for years. Having now read it, I have to say it's an intriguing little book. On some level, it can be considered an important and timeless allegory for how readily people give up their liberty if only it is taken from them gradually. That message seems particularly appropriate since I am indeed posting this on the 4th of July. In this case, the villainous auctioneer barely even needs to ask people to give up their property, and because his requests-turned-demands are increased gradually, people feel powerless to stop him. Though it certainly doesn't hurt his cause that he manages to disarm the town early in the book, and therein lies a lesson I think those of us living in the 21st century desperately need to relearn. But at the same time, one does sort of question the plausibility of the entire premise of this book. While these kinds of gradual declines are entirely realistic under some circumstances, I found myself questioning, throughout the entire length of the book, the plausibility of these events occurring in the specific kind of town depicted. Characters engage in repetitive and circular arguments about what to do in their situation, but they seem not to notice that they've fallen into such a cycle of repetitive and circular arguments, and the result is that people who one would expect to be the first to defend themselves and their property simply don't. Because characters are slow to take any action, much of the book's length seems to drag just a bit. It's only a little over 200 pages long, but it feels longer simply because nothing seems to be happening during reasonably long sections of its length. Along similar lines, likely the issues I had with plausibility wouldn't have come so prominently to mind had the book been just a little bit shorter and punchier. That is to say, I focused on the implausibilities because I had opportunities and the time to do so. But on the other hand, despite all those issues, the characters are interesting, the prose flows well, and the premise is certainly interesting and arguably quite important to think about. More than once, I had the thought that the book could easily be read as an allegory for excessive taxation or the slide into totalitarianism. Equally, and probably more in line with the author's intentions, though I'm guessing about that, the book also offers some fascinating commentary on the differences between life in the city and the country, and the costs of our accelerating march into modernity. Change may indeed be inevitable, but that doesn't necessarily mean change is good. All in all, I don't think the book quite lives up to its stellar reputation, but it's nevertheless an enjoyable read and one that ought to give you a few things to think about even after you finish. And just as a quick aside before I move on to the next book, let me just note, I don't know whether you'll hear it or not, but if you hear fireworks, firecrackers banging and crackling in the background, that's my neighbors launching some fireworks. I can't control what they do and when they do it, and I'm not going to reshoot all of this every time a bang goes off. So if you hear some background noise, just know that that's what's going on. Anyway, next up is a book that isn't exactly horror, but there's certainly some overlap with the genre. It's a book called Psychopathology Foundations for a Contemporary Understanding. Each chapter of this book has different authors, but it's edited by James E. Maddox and Barbara A. Winstead. Like all textbooks, it's ludicrously overpriced, but since I have a horror-adjacent interest in the darker side of the human mind, I enjoy reading psych textbooks from time to time. This one is okay. I like that it's not cartoonish and overly illustrated like far too many textbooks are these days, but I didn't learn quite as much as I'd hoped. If you're new to the subject, it'd be a pretty good introduction, but if you've read a fair amount, there's really not much new here. A lot of the book's length basically repeats and explains what you might already have read in the DSM-5, if you happen to have a copy of that. But because it's not horror, it's nonfiction, and therefore not necessarily of interest to everybody watching on this channel, I'm going to go ahead and put this one to the side and move on to the next one. That next one happens to be one of the Nightworms books that came in this very month's package, and that was Shooting Star by Joe R. Lansdale. It's a tiny little book, so my review will have to be pretty brief, lest I prattle on longer than the book itself. But it's really hard to go wrong with Lansdale, so I dove right into it as soon as the package arrived. It's the story of a small group of people who survive a collision between their train and a flying saucer. It goes about as well as you'd expect for them. There's really not a whole lot of meat on its bones. Again, it's very small, and I'm certainly not going to say it's Lansdale at his very best. But what it is a short and charming throwback to the old sci-fi horror stories of several decades past. If you grew up watching that kind of stuff, I think you'll get a kick out of this one. Next, we have They All Died Screaming, a wonderful title if I ever heard one, by Christopher Triana. Sometimes you just want to read something disturbing and bleak, the kind of thing that might threaten the last vestiges of your faith in humanity. Y'all know sometimes I'm keen on that sort of thing, and this is such a book. As extreme horror goes, author Christopher Triana knows exactly which buttons to press. That's not to say it's the most disturbing book I've ever read. It isn't. But if you're not immersed in the horror genre the way I am, it will assuredly rank among the most disturbing you've read, and I mean that as a compliment. The novel alternates between two stories, and the reader spends most of the book wondering when the two tales will eventually intersect. One is a sort of neo-zombie story about a group of people, drunks, sex workers, homeless people, and other dregs of society, trying to survive a plague that causes people to incessantly scream and turn to violence before their inevitable demise. The other is the story of a kidnapped boy, forced and eventually brainwashed, into participating in horrific murders, and in fact some things beyond murder, though you'll have to read the book to find out more, because if I even hinted at some of the things in this book, I'd at least get demonetized and possibly kicked off of YouTube. Often, that kind of alternating storytelling, where we have two stories and we switch every other chapter, would be annoying to me. Usually, I'd find one story so much more interesting than the other that I would essentially resent every other chapter. However, I'm pleased to report that's not the case here. The two stories, though seemingly completely disconnected and unrelated to each other, are both fascinating and both disturbing in entirely different ways, with the effect that the reader is always eager to return to both tales. However, where the novel fails a little bit is in its ending. I won't spoil anything here, but the novel eventually finds its way to a twist that simply didn't work for me at all. I do recommend the book. In fact, I highly recommend it if you like disturbing books or extreme horror, but I suspect most readers might want to exercise their own imaginations a bit and substitute a different ending. It's hard to blame the author for that though, because as you know, if you've been around this channel for a while, I've in fact made a whole video about why it's so difficult to end a horror story. It is difficult to end a horror story, whether it's a film or a short story or a novel. So the fact that the ending wasn't quite what I wanted is unsurprising and doesn't severely detract from my enjoyment of the book. You know, a lot of the time I really like a good, quiet ghost story. But while we're on the topic of, well, the complete opposite of quiet horror, the next book I read this month was The Haunted Vagina by Carlton Millick III. If you've been around the bizarro genre for a while, Carlton's work is probably already known to you. He writes some of the weirdest stuff I've ever read, and this one is no exception. The author is never afraid to go for the gross out, but even more importantly, he doesn't shy away from the just plain weird. And this book delivers the weird in spades. Fundamentally, the title tells you everything you need to know. This is a book about a guy who discovers a portal to another world inside his girlfriend's lady parts. And if that sounds like something you want to read, the book won't disappoint. The title pretty much tells you what you're in for. It's a short book, and that's a good thing because the story is fascinating and highly entertaining for the length of just under 100 pages. But I honestly doubt I could take such a story for much longer. As it is, though, it's the perfect single-sitting dose of bonkers fiction I think a lot of weirdos out there might be looking for. The next one has been on my reading list for a while now, and it's a doozy. It's a book called Panzram, A Journal of Murder. About half of the book consists of writings by Carl Panzram, who's described as succinctly as I've seen him described anywhere by Wikipedia, as a, quote, serial killer, spree killer, mass murderer, rapist, child molester, arsonist, robber, thief, and burglar. He claimed to have raped over 1,000 men, confessed to 21 murders, and is suspected in over 100 others. In this book, he shares his thoughts about criminal justice and explains exactly why he did the things that he did. It's difficult to know how to review a book like this, because one's first instinct upon reading it is to immediately distance oneself from its contents. Certainly one doesn't want to endorse much of what it contains, although I think all of us would be hard-pressed to argue that even someone as evil as Panzram didn't have a few thoughts worthy of our attention from time to time. However, I do want to endorse the book itself, because however much we may despise its subject, and in fact the author of about half of its text, the rest being filled in by authors Thomas E. Gaddis and James O. Long, the simple fact of the matter is this book contains arguably one of the best accounts of human malevolence ever committed to paper. There's a naive view held by probably far too many people that human beings have fundamentally good intentions and that whatever evil people do is typically the result of good motivations leading people to do horrible things. To be sure, that does occur, and I'm certainly not going to argue that human beings have fundamentally evil intentions, at least not in general terms. We have good intentions and evil intentions. However, something we desperately need to understand is that some human beings do have fundamentally evil intentions. Panzram's crimes were brutal and committed with the full knowledge of their destructive consequences. His writings, detailed in this book, paint a portrait of a man who became so embittered about his own mistreatment that he resented not only his own life, but life itself, and sought essentially the eradication of humanity. Here's a man who not only committed rapes, arsons, burglaries, and murders, but describes in some detail how he even intended to start a war between the United States and England. Understanding that kind of a mind is useful for anyone, but particularly for those of us interested in the psychology of criminality. The book itself punctuates Panzram's autobiographical writings and letters with historical narratives supplied by the other two authors, which serves two purposes. First, it provides the necessary context to aid the reader's understanding, but arguably more importantly, it provides a momentary respite from reading the words of a man who was highly intelligent and highly evil, and could describe his motivations with almost flawless logic if only one were to grant his axioms. Though I don't, and most readers won't, grant, in fact, such axioms as the idea that the world would be better off without humanity, it is a disturbing intellectual exercise to follow Panzram's arguments to their conclusions. It's certainly not a pleasant book, but I honestly think it should be required reading. And though it's non-fiction, I think it ought to be clear to anyone why it might be of interest to readers of horror, because though it's not as explicit in its descriptions of horrifying things as some other works, it is nevertheless one of the most horrifying things ever put to paper. Next up, I decided to read the Bible, making this a very strange month in terms of the, I guess, diversity of my reading. But I came to the realization earlier this month that though I'd read essentially all of the Bible, probably actually all of it, I'd never actually sat down and read the whole thing cover to cover in one go. I'd only read it piecewise and a little bit at a time over the years, so I wanted to rectify that and read it straight through. It seems like the sort of thing we all ought to do. Whatever our religious views might be, and I'm certainly not taking this channel in the direction of encouraging or discouraging any particular religious affiliation, but whatever our views might be, it's one of those fundamental books upon which so much of our cultural and literary tradition is based that we all ought to be familiar with it. The particular version I chose to read was this Didache Bible, which is based on the Revised Standard Version Second Catholic Edition, though I also supplemented it with the King James Version. I have some reasons for that decision. First of all, it's worth noting that Catholic and Protestant Bibles aren't quite identical. The Catholic version contains 7 books not featured in Protestant versions, as well as some additional chapters in 2 other books. The reason has to do with the sources the different denominations use for their canon. The Catholics follow a Greek translation used by the earliest church fathers, known as the Septuagint, which considered the additional books canonical. The Protestants didn't just choose to delete the books during the Reformation, but instead followed the development of the Jewish canon, which did not include the disputed texts. Why did I choose a Catholic version instead of a Protestant version? 2 reasons. The first is simply that I grew up in a Catholic background, so I just know that version better. But to me, the far more important reason is that even if one is Protestant or non-religious or does not share Catholic beliefs, and even if one, for example, a Protestant, only wants to consider the shorter version canonical, the more one chooses to read, the better. We ought to read about everything, whether we agree with it or not, so we can better inform our own arguments. In fact, I read somewhere that though they didn't consider them canonical, Protestant Bibles often included the so-called deuterocanonical books as an appendix until sometime around the 20th century, just for reference, much as I'm suggesting. And that's another reason why I chose this Didache Bible. because it's an extremely well annotated version with the kinds of notes and cross-references that help us understand what the authors meant, even though our reading is separated from their writing by thousands of years. However, I also wanted to supplement my reading with this King James version because there are some passages in which I think the older English is a bit more elegant, and because this particular version features illustrations throughout by Gustave Doré, one of my favorite artists. Though to be completely honest, my favorite of his works is not one of the biblical illustrations, but his La Famille du Saltimbanque, l'Enfant Blessé, which is currently on display as part of the European Paintings and Sculpture Before 1900 collection at the Denver Art Museum. Anyway, I'm not actually reviewing the Bible because trying to review the Bible would probably be considered blasphemous by the believers and useless by the non-believers. But I will say that I recommend the combination of these two editions. And since we're always talking about horror here, it's also worth noting that much of the Bible consists of what I would fundamentally consider to be horror stories. For example, we have the famous tale of Cain and Abel in Genesis, which I think we can interpret as a kind of psychological horror story to do with how resentment can lead one down a destructive path. In fact, much as Panzram dealt with in perhaps more detail. And then, of course, there are the very strange and often horrific visions in John's Revelation. But in between, there's plenty of stuff that not only served as inspiration for plenty of horror stories in more modern times, but stories that seem horrific themselves. The episode with The Witch of Endor could easily fit within our favorite genre, for example, as could this haunting passage from the first book of the Maccabees. And just to read from the Bible, 1 Maccabees chapter 1 verses 58 through 61 read, "They kept using violence against Israel, against those found month after month in the cities. And on the 25th day of the month they offered sacrifice on the altar, which was upon the altar of burnt offering. According to the decree, they put to death the women who had their children circumcised, and their families and those who circumcised them, and they hung the infants from their mothers' necks." Horrific stuff indeed. I read somewhere that relatively few of my fellow Americans, and also true of people around the world, have actually read the entire Bible, and whatever your religious beliefs may or may not be, that seems like a grave oversight to anyone who wants to understand our literary history. And yeah, of course that includes the history of the horror genre. As a matter of fact, a project I've been thinking about is making a video, or perhaps even a series of videos, discussing the various horror stories within the biblical narrative, and explaining how some of our modern horror stories grew out of Jewish and Christian traditions. So if you're interested in that, do be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. I'm not sure exactly when I'll get to it, but you won't want to miss out on it, or indeed any of my other wonderful spooky videos. That advertisement aside, that brings us to some non-horror books. The first of these could actually be argued to intersect with the horror genre, though you certainly won't find it shelved in the horror section, and that's American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer by Kai Bird and Martin J. Sherwin. As you can probably guess from the title, this is a biography of Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. And I have a bit of a confession to make. This book has actually been sitting in my library awaiting my attention for nearly 20 years. But since there's a new movie about Oppenheimer coming out in just a few weeks, I finally got around to reading it because I wanted to compare it to the film and see how accurate the movie might be in some of its details. This is an impressive literary achievement. I don't recall seeing many biographies that are more meticulously researched or well documented. The authors certainly must be applauded for that. They've also done a remarkably good job of capturing the many different facets of a truly complex historical character and presented them in a way that remains mostly lively and readable throughout. But despite being easily the most detailed biography on the subject I've ever read, and as far as I'm aware, the most detailed ever written, it does have some flaws. Probably the biggest complaint I had while reading it was that the book focused perhaps too much on the political persecution of Oppenheimer after the war. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that's not an important chapter, both in his life personally and in history generally, but I found myself wishing the book spent a little less of its time there and a little more of its time on the development of the bomb itself and its immediate aftermath, as those were the periods of Oppenheimer's life I personally found most interesting. As it is, because the book spends so much time on that one part of his life, it does seem a bit overlong and a bit dry, at least for me, in at least a few places. And along similar lines, the authors were not entirely successful in even-handedly presenting their material. They clearly have certain opinions regarding who were the heroes and villains in history. Even while we may agree with their assessment in many cases, particularly with the benefit of hindsight, the book might have been improved had the opposing views been given a little bit more of a fair hearing. Like Oppenheimer himself, history is complicated and often difficult to understand. This book, despite a few failings here and there, mostly does a good job of helping us to understand history and one particularly fascinating character therein. I would not recommend this for light reading, but I would consider it required reading for anyone engaged in a study either of Oppenheimer or of atomic history. As for horror, this book really isn't. It's a biography. But it does touch on some horrific topics. The bomb itself is pretty horrific. Even beyond that, there's the psychological horror Oppenheimer experienced after he saw his invention get away from him, and then the horror of the political persecution. But the book doesn't really set out to scare the reader. However, for whatever it's worth, though I haven't had the opportunity to see the new Oppenheimer movie yet, I've read that it's so disturbing that some people have had to leave screenings early. So there's at least some horror here. Finally, I close out the month with a book that has nothing to do with horror whatsoever, but it's been one that I've been reading a few pages at a time for quite a while now, and I finally finished it, and that's The Soviet Chess Primer by Ilya Meiselas. Originally called simply Chess when printed in Russian, this book was widely used as an early instruction handbook for Soviet chess players. Now, far be it from me to want anything to do with the Soviet Union, but even I have to admit this is one of the finest tools to quickly advance your chess game if you're, let's say, an advanced beginner or early intermediate player. Where I think some people may become a bit confused is this word primer in the title. Though this book does begin with the basic rules of chess, it tells you how to play the game, and in fact, it's a book that even teaches you how to read itself because it takes the time to explain algebraic chess notation right at the start. It then quickly moves on to more advanced tactical and strategic ideas. Beginners who genuinely are just learning the basic rules of the game could hypothetically read this book. It does tell you technically everything you need to know to start from zero and learn chess. But I think those beginners would very quickly be overwhelmed by the more advanced ideas discussed, even as early as the second or third chapters. However, readers who already have some familiarity with the game will benefit a lot from its discussions of ideas, which are fairly simple to understand, but often difficult to apply in real games. For example, simple tactics like pins and forks are easy enough for even absolute beginners to understand. However, where this book shines is that it provides enough examples of increasing complexity that reading the book will help the reader begin to recognize when those tactics might become relevant. Chess is largely a matter of pattern recognition, and this book will help you start to recognize the patterns. Ultimately, I would recommend this book for the serious beginner or early intermediate chess player looking to deepen his or her knowledge of the game. Alas, that's all I managed for this month. Not quite as many as I always hope for, though admittedly a few of these were real beasts in length, so I think I did okay. And admittedly, this month was not quite as horror-centric as my reading often is, but as we've noted before on this channel, my reading habits, as you can see, are fairly eclectic. Anyway, I'm off to engage in some Independence Day revelry and get to work on some of my reading for July. Do be sure to like and share this video, leave me a comment, and all that good YouTube-y stuff. And until next time, as always, take care and stay scared.